Thank you for the opportunity to share in this exchange. The title of my presentation is "The Science is In, What Next?" If you want the best summary of the evidence for airborne transmission, the virtual workshop from the National Academy of Sciences is probably the best place to go. Here's a list of some of the highlights I noted from the workshop. First of all, a new definition of droplet, which is fairly large. The differentiation between plume and room dispersion aerodynamics, plume being independent of room airflow patterns until it loses its kinetic energy. The definition of close range or close contact airborne transmission, and differentiating between different types of airborne transmission. Another point that I found very relevant is the fact that the reproduction number is not just a property of the disease, but the product of the interaction between disease, host, and environmental conditions. For instance, the Skagit choir outbreak has an effective reproduction number of 32 to 52, but if that one choir member had stayed home, their effective reproduction number would have been 1, 2, or 3. The Diamond Princess is a similar example. During this workshop, it was repeatedly mentioned that this is a wicked problem. Wicked problems are those that are very difficult to define, are very complex, having many factors, and can really never be solved. The important thing about dealing with a wicked problem is to use a multidisciplinary approach and not get stuck in one perspective. The problem of the mode of transmission of virus diseases reminds me of the Indian folk story of 6 blind people all trying to figure out the elephant. They all have a piece of it and they're all right, but overall they're all wrong. So I think everyone's got beyond the dichotomous categories, but now let's look at it as not only a continuum, but a continuum in at least 3 directions and probably more. So for each set of conditions, we have different apportionments of the transmission paths. Applying controls or changing the environment will change the relative contributions of the different paths. If we're exposed to any or a combination of the 3 or 4 C's, obviously aerosol transmission will be more important. For those who are interested in this apportionment, Rachel Jones wrote a nice paper on the relative contributions of transmission routes for COVID-19 amongst healthcare personnel providing patient care. However, because things can change so much, aren't we really just counting how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? We need to be prepared for all possible combinations rather than wait until we have the science that can determine what will happen when and with a very high degree of precision. So the workshop had more than 3 or 4 C's. They had 6 C's, and they're listed here. And I would add a 7th, circulation or outdoor air supply. I'd like to dig a little deeper into the masking issue, but before I do, I want to make the point that distancing is what led to the leveling of the curve. And where distancing isn't happening, that's where we're seeing the major problems. Getting back to masking, where there's a low community risk, masking is symbolic. It's a sign of solidarity. It's something everyone can do, and it says we're all in this together. In a medium community risk, it becomes etiquette and source control. You keep your oral and nasal emissions to yourself. When you're in a high risk zone, it can be both source control and protection at the worker. In Montreal, where my daughter lives, she's wearing an N95 mask, which has a valve, and therefore she puts a procedural mask on top of it for emission etiquette. Right from the beginning of this pandemic, healthcare workers have been the canaries in the coal mine. The WHO estimates that 4.16 million healthcare workers have been infected and thousands have died. When China finally admitted that there was human-to-human transmission occurring on January 20th, they classified this disease as a Class B infectious disease similar to SARS-1. However, they prescribed Class A infectious protective measures similar to Ebola precautions. This is exactly what Justice Campbell recommended when he dealt with the conflict between infection control and health and safety, and when he ruled in favor of the precautionary principle. And it reminds me of the saying from George Santayana, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." So the Chinese used layers upon layers of protective equipment, an N95 with a surgical mask on top. You can see on this YouTube video how they donned and doffed their protective. Here's the curve of Chinese healthcare worker infections. You can see where the proclamation was on January 20th by the red arrow, and you can see in about 3 weeks they had wrestled the rate of healthcare worker infections down to 0. Here I've shown the same arrows in the epidemiological curve so you can see where it was in the context of the whole epidemic in China. There was not a single infection among 42,000 healthcare workers who were recruited to help out in Hubei between January 24th and April 16th. Overall in China, just over 4% of all COVID cases were healthcare workers, whereas in Canada we're pretty close to 20%. This is a rate of healthcare infections that is 6 times greater than the Chinese level. With the help of Peter Smith from the Institute of Work and Health, we figured out how many healthcare workers were in Ontario, and based on the publicly available numbers, we calculated that healthcare workers were 4 times more likely to be infected than the general population, which translates into 75% of healthcare worker infections being work-related. And lest that you might think that it's all due to long-term care facilities, in one Toronto hospital, the infection rate was 4%, which was about 14 times higher than the general rate in Ontario. It's been suggested that healthcare workers outside the workplace have been lax with their infection control practices. However, based on a cross-Canada healthcare survey that we did back in April and May, we found very high levels of fear reported amongst the almost 6,000 respondents, with 11% indicating that they are feeling as much fear as they have ever felt. Also, 43% are extremely concerned about bringing the virus home. Among the respondents to the survey, 55% screened positive for anxiety issues and 42% for depression. A key issue in this pandemic has been the lack of sound scientific reasoning in the rationale being provided for protective measures. Rationale provided contains logical fallacies, selection bias, and misinterpretation of the evidence. A double standard is being applied to the level of evidence required. Droplet precautions don't require any justification, whereas airborne protection requires RCTs. Papers are being cited which actually state the opposite of what they are cited for. The success of other countries is being misrepresented or ignored, and our own failings aren't being recognized or explained away. For policymakers, what to do next? Well, the science is in, so recognize the airborne component of this complex transmission picture and change the guidelines now. Recognize the precautionary principle and apply it. Make sure there's adequate infection control measures to prevent all infections and learn from what other countries have done. We can monitor our progress by counting and publishing healthcare worker infections. These are the canaries. They deserve presumptive recognition for work-relatedness for compensation purposes. Take a look at what happened with the scientific reviews and fix it. Expand our toolbox to include more complex tools. Make sure that our public responses are related to regional risk and thus are a graduated continuum or hierarchy or spectrum of controls. And finally, have politicians and responsible bureaucrats offer to attend funerals of infected healthcare workers who have died to apologize and promise to do better. Mind you, there's enough blame to go around for everyone, so we all need to accept responsibility and do something quick.